Hi there, my name is Grant Ronald from the Oracle Product Management team. Thanks for coming along to this session on building intelligence, how Oracle built a digital assistant. As I said, I'm part of the product management team for Oracle Digital Assistant, which is our cloud service for building conversational AI digital assistants. And what I wanted to do in this session was really give you an end-to-end overview of how artificial intelligence, machine learning can be used in a real practical use case, and in this case, how we built a digital assistant or a chatbot to help a lot of our customers and developers. Now, I will be talking a little bit about some of our future things, and some of these features are not yet production, so this is the usual Oracle Safe Harbor statement. So over the next 30 minutes or so, what I want to do is break into about 4 sections of how we built this digital assistant. And the first thing I want to focus on is what we built. What was the digital assistant we built? And I'm going to show you a quick 4 or 5 minute demo of the digital assistant so you can see the end product that we were aiming for. I'll then look into how we started designing the intelligence. What was the whole end-to-end process of making this digital assistant understand natural language and be a seamless conversation assistant with users? I'm then going to drill into the actual building blocks, and I'll go into some of the demos of how we built the digital assistant, how we built the intents and entities, how we trained the language model. And then the last section is, how do we take this from being just a regular chatbot to something more advanced, really bringing an awesome conversational AI experience. And that's all about the testing we did and how we improved the language models. So that's the outline for the next couple of minutes. Let's crack on. What is it we've built? Now, about a year ago, myself and my development team sat down and we decided we really wanted to build a digital assistant that would show the full power of the platform and also show the full power of what digital assistants or conversational AI can do. Now, there's only so many pizza bots that you can build. So we decided, what can we build that would actually be useful in production quality? And in the end, we had this idea, why don't we build a digital assistant that will help people build digital assistants? It's an assistant that will help. And then we started thinking this could be something we'll embed in the product or part of the documentation. And ultimately, that's what Artie, which is the digital assistant we created, its goal is Artie sits inside the product or the documentation page and it helps you build the digital assistant. So let me go and show you a couple of examples of Artie in action. Okay, so what you should be seeing now is an example of our documentation page. And people can go through and find documentation tutorials. But we've got Artie sitting in the corner here, and we can bring up Artie and ask Artie questions about building the digital assistant. So the first thing Artie does is introduce himself. I say himself. We agreed Artie was he, although Artie's actually a robotic personality. We decided, in terms of conversational AI, choosing personalities, kind of important feature. So you'll see the reflection of this in Artie's kind of tone of voice. Salutations, he says, gives an indication of how to get help. And then, ask me your most pressing question. So I might ask Artie a question such as, how do I build a digital assistant? And Artie comes back and responds. But one of the key things we wanted to do here was not simply replace the documentation we have. It works in harmony with the documentation. So Artie, like a true assistant, helps guide us towards information as well. So we can jump directly to the documentation, or we can go to a tutorial, or even bringing in things like PowerPoint, these kind of articles that can be brought in as well. Let's try asking Artie something else. Can I build a skill in Spanish? Because I'm interested in building multilingual bots. And Artie answers that. Yeah, you'd like to build. Here's how we do that as well. So as you can see, Artie's pretty good at just ask a question, get an answer. Now, there's some more conversational elements to this. If I asked a question, for example, what built-in channels do you have? here's one of the examples where there's actually a couple of topics that RT's maybe not sure which one is it. Is it about built-in channels? Is it insights on channels? Or is it none of the above? So like a human would do, we clarify meaning. So it's built-in channels. And RT says, excellent, I'm most willing to help. But look, there's one of these channels that we could choose. So I'm going to pick iOS, for example, and there RT responds in his typical way about the how to set up that channel. And I can say to RT, thanks very much. And RT responds in kind as well. So RT deals with certain small talks. So let me ask something else. What is a custom component? Because I've heard about this, but I'm not sure what it is. And RT gives me some more information. And I could maybe ask, tell me more about this. And what RT's done here is that, first of all, it's context. RT knows we're talking about a certain thing, custom components. And RT goes out and searches on other sources. So, for example, our documentation or training material, and brings in other pieces of information to the user as well. And the final thing I might say is, well, look, maybe this didn't help me. This didn't help me. RT apologizes. And what will actually happen now is that I can share my email address, and RT will send an indication to our development team via Slack. So as a developer, we're immediately getting a ping that that's not working. So that's the full example of what RT does as a digital assistant. Let's go back to the presentation. So how do we go about building this intelligent assistant? Well, I know there's a lot we're going to talk about AI and machine learning, but there's also a more holistic approach to building great digital assistants. The first is, what was the goal we wanted to achieve with RT? And we sat down and talked about this digital assistant that should be helpful. Users shouldn't need some sort of script to follow. It should be intelligent to understand if you say things like thanks, or this didn't help, or even if you ask for the weather, RT should be able to deal with those kind of things. And ultimately, we also wanted RT to be better than going to the documentation and using Control F, for example. And that's one of the advantages of NLP, natural language processing, is that with a document like the documentation, you have to know the right terms to search for. But with natural language, I can maybe state more of a problem that I have, or using my own terminology, and RT will interpret that using the NLP model to try and direct that to the right area. So that's the goals. Conversational design, I'll show you a little bit about how we started designing the personality of RT. And then I'm going to show you how we partitioned. RT is actually behind the scenes made up of many different skills, or what we call chatbots, that are automatically routed depending on the question you ask. We looked at and we identified common functionality. As I mentioned, one of the things we want to achieve is that we don't want RT to say, sorry, I don't understand. So we wanted to have strategies that ensure that if RT doesn't deal with something as an intent, that's when, for example, we did the search. So we created common functionality like search APIs to search into documentation and external sources like blogs, and also, as I showed, our integration with Slack as well. So we created those standard building blocks. And towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to show you how we tested RT and the extensive test suites that we built. So I touched on personality, and I know this is maybe one of those softer skills, but it's actually super important that we thought about what the personality of a digital assistant should be, to the point that we created a backstory for RT about RT's character traits, strengths, weaknesses, and sample conversations about how RT might actually speak. So let's get back into the demos. This time I want to show you how, as an interface, you're dealing with RT, but RT itself is made up of many different skills or individual chatbots. So let me go and show you that in our environment. Okay, so what you're seeing here is Oracle Digital Assistant as the platform or cloud service. And here's our digital assistant called ARTI. And you'll see that ARTI is actually made up of 12 different skills. Now, this is important because as a development team, you know, ARTI can cover maybe 300, 400, 500 different questions. We didn't want to build that all in one place. So we partition this off into separate skills. So for example, there's a skill on if you're asking questions about, you know, our out of the box HCM skill, or if you're asking questions about pricing, that's part of our go-to-market skill. So we could actually have developers who knew things like go-to-market and would create the language models specific to that because they knew the domain, they knew the ways, the phrases that people would use to ask questions about things like pricing, for example. Now, what's really neat about this feature in Digital Assistant is, although you as a user have a single interface to ARTI, there are many different skills, and the Digital Assistant uses artificial intelligence to route your request to the right skill. So I ask a question on, for example, multi-language skills, for example, building the skills in Spanish. The Digital Assistant knows to route it to this skill, and the way it knows is it takes all the language models from each of the skills and creates its own kind of Uber model. And you can actually see this in action here. I'll maybe show you this as part of the demo as well. So if I ask, as I did before, what is a digital assistant? We can see the response, and that's been dealt with by the skill and digital assistant skill. Now, ask a different question. Can I build a skill in Spanish? You'll see here that we've routed off to a different skill to deal with that question. And that's all been handled automatically. Where this starts to look really nice is, like human beings, you know, when we have conversation, as I do now, we're jumping topics. So if I ask a question, how do I integrate with Service Cloud? We're again going to jump off to another skill, as you can see here, and we're being asked a question. So in the middle of a conversation about integrating digital assistants with Service Cloud, ARTI asked me, well, which one of these topics would you like to know about? But I'm going to actually answer with something completely different. I'm going to ask a different question. I'm going to say, how so what you're seeing now is that we started off this conversation, we moved to talking about multi-language skills, we then moved to talk about Service Cloud integration, but in the middle of that conversation, we've gone off and talked about channels, and I'm going to answer that with iOS. And what's interesting here is we now go back to the conversation we were having. And this is all taken care automatically. You can actually see the flow of the conversation from one topic, one skill, to another, jumping around as we move through those different conversations. And that's a really important feature of the Digital Assistant platform here, is that ability to understand how it routes the requests to the right skill. And once you've had a conversation with that skill, if that skill is still the right skill to be speaking to for any subsequent questions. And I'll show you more about how we build those models up later on in the presentation. So let's go back to the presentation now. So how do we actually build it? And this is where I get into show you things like the NLP, the natural language processing. There are actually, I know, 4 sole building blocks of building any of these individual skills. The intent, so the intent is each individual question or use case that the bot can answer. There's entities, which are any variable parts of an intent. So for example, when I asked the question about built-in channels, RT asks me, well, which channel would you like to know about? That variable part is the entity. There's a conversation flow. There's how the conversation moves back and forward. If RT asks me other questions to clarify. And then the key to all this is the utterances. And it's the utterances are sample phrases that we use to train the model to try and understand that when I ask a question, that even though it's not been trained with the right words, that we understand that there's some words that are interchangeable, or it's a high probability you mean this thing. Or, as you saw in the demo, when RT is not 100% sure, RT might say, well, look, do you mean this thing or this thing? Which again is exactly what we do as human beings in conversations if you're not quite sure. So again, I'm going to go in and show you this in the demonstration, a little bit of show and tell. So let me go back to the IDE now. Okay, so let's go back and look at some of the individual skills. And I talked about channels, so let's look at the channel skill, and you can see how the channel skill was developed. So let's focus on some of these first. What we did when we built each individual skill is we thought, what are the common use cases or the common questions that this skill has to support? And we thought, and we started to design the intent so that they weren't too broad or they weren't too minuscule, too narrow in their domain. So we tried to create, and this is a little bit of kind of, I suppose, experience of understanding what is that level of granularity that you create for your intent. But here you can say, for example, I have an intent for dealing with when people ask, what built-in channels do you support? Okay, so a digital assistant, a bot, can be deployed on things like web pages or iOS or Android or the like. So what we had to do was train the language model to understand how people might ask about that feature of the product. And we did this by basically user testing. We would go out to a number of different users and say, you know, if you were to ask a question about this topic, how would you say it? And we did that with a number of different users, because what's really important about training the model is, if I was the only person writing the utterances, I've got a particular way of thinking about that problem, which might not reflect to other people as well. There's obviously the explicit requests, but there's also kind of implicit requests where you maybe state much more of your problem rather than definitively what you're trying to view or see. So we took samples of those user experience discussions and we created variations in the sentence. So for an example, you can see, you know, can I embed my bot? Can I expose my chatbot? So we're mixing up phrases like bot, chatbot, digital assistant, skill, because we didn't want to always train it with the same terms. Okay, so we keep trying to keep variation, natural variation in there in these training utterances. So you can see I've got some questions asked with can I, I've got some that ask with do you, could we, and it's also important things like varying the personal pronouns you have, so you're not skewing the language models such that it thinks everything is to do with I, you know, the first personal pronoun. So we want to make sure what the clear signals when we're training the language model. And for this intent, the clear signals are things like the words channels and any synonyms or variations of those words, and asking around, you know, maybe I want to find out, I want to know the built-in or the out-of-the-box channels, and we create variations of these phrases here. Obviously, as we hit the train button, the NLP engine has a greater knowledge than those 112 phrases we work with, because our language models are already pre-trained with huge amounts of corpus of English, so that it will have some knowledge that, for example, if you ask about Android, it might also recognize that if you ask about Samsung, well, Samsung and Android might be terms that are interchangeable or close, or at least have some closeness in terms of their meaning. So we would build up our intent here, train each intent with utterances, And as I mentioned, there were some examples like built-in channels where we knew that there might be a follow-up question, okay? Because the answer for the built-in channel for iOS is a completely different answer for the built-in channel for web. So rather than having separate intents for each of those questions, we would create, as I mentioned earlier, an entity. And an entity is one variable part of the user input. So here I've got an entity called built-in channels. So you can see here is where I defined all the possible channels that somebody could ask about. And I also set up synonyms. So if I was to ask the question, what built-in channels do you have? And I hadn't specified a specific channel, Artie would respond with, well, here's a list of the things I know about. But equally, if I'd asked the question, I want to know about the iOS built-in channel, it would go straight to the answer for that because it's already slotted that piece of variable information. And as you can see, we can set up synonyms as well, so that we understand that if I say, how do I deploy a chatbot, via an iPhone or an Apple device, it would understand, well, that's the same answer for iOS. We also did some neat things like, what happens if somebody said, I want to set up a channel for iOS, Android, and web, and supplied 3 values for this entity. Well, what we decided was that rather than trying to deal with the fact that all those combinations, we'd actually set that multiple values is set to off. That and prompt for disambiguation means on. So what that means is if I had asked a question like, what are the built-in channels that you have for iOS and Android, or tell me more about the built-in channels for iOS and Android, Artie would come back and say, would you mind if we can focus on one channel at a time, and then would present those 2 options to me, and then I would choose from one of those. So that helps give us a little bit of smartness and intelligence, because we're trying not to be too advanced with the language models here, but instead try to use design techniques by getting Artie to narrow down the scope of the question, which makes us get to the right question a lot more easily. So those are the very basic building blocks and the features of how we train the language model. Let me go back to one more slide, and then we'll go into a little bit deeper in how we improved the language models as well. So everything you've seen so far allowed us to build a pretty good digital assistant. But for us, how could we really push the limits of the natural language processing and the AI and the model so that it was smarter and smarter and understand more? And the key to that was testing, because with language models, the only way you can really tell if you make the right decisions is testing. You might find that you're adding some new utterances and they don't particularly work, or you're not sure if they work, or will they cause clashes? Well, the only thing you can do is you can test it. There's a little bit of suck and see in terms of when you're working with these language models. So testing is hugely important. And this was our key strategy to utterance improvement. Once the bot was going live in phased releases, what we wanted to do was go back and look at how the bot was performing, look at whether there was phrases that weren't being understood, and whether we needed to train the language model. And we would do this, what we call the 80-20 split. So any new training utterances, i.e. from the conversation logs that we found through Artie, that things where people were saying to Artie, we took those conversation logs and we did an 80-20 split. 80% of the phrases people were asking Artie, we would take to retrain the bot, to retrain Artie to make Artie smarter. 20% we would keep back for testing. And that was important because it meant we're testing the language models with phrases it's not specifically been tested, or it's not specifically been trained with. And that was super important. And this was how we wanted to measure the improvement. There was also one thing I think is really worth mentioning, especially when we're focused on machine learning and AI, that we decided not to try and solve every problem with more AI or throwing more data at the NLP engine. There were some situations, for example, there might have been a question about how do you change the avatar, the bot avatar, or how do you change the user avatar? Maybe there was two different intents. Now, somebody asked a question like, how do I change the persona avatar? And we weren't quite sure what it meant. Rather than trying to train the model to understand that slightly unusual use case, we would just do a clever conversational design technique, which was respond with both, okay? Because the user would very rarely complain that we gave them more information that they wanted. So sometimes not all problems were solved with improving the NLP. And the last thing was, very briefly, is that within Digital Assistant as a platform, we have analytics and insights which allow us to look at how the bot's performing, what people are saying to the bot, what phrases are unresolved, and those were also our source of new training data. So let me show you a little bit more about how we did this testing. Again, I'll go back into Digital Assistant to show you this. So here, within Oracle Digital Assistant, you have the ability to add what we call batch tests. So if I go to here, and I can load in a set of batch tests. I'm just going to load them in now here. And what those are, it's a simple Excel spreadsheet which has a bunch of phrases and the intents that they should resolve to, okay? And if I run those, it will run through, and let me just try one more time here. There we go. It will run through, and within the batch script, it says this phrase should map to this intent, and it will do those tests. And because we have this batch test, we can run these at any point. So any changes we make to the NLP, the model, we can go back and check the impact of that. And you can see that, I think in this test, we've got about 100 odd tests that so far we're getting maybe about 30, 40, 50% failure rate, which means that there's probably a lot of stuff we can do to improve and look at that. And rather than run it to completion, let me just stop the run. And you can go back and you can look at some of the phrases that were failing. And there you can see from the test, okay, we've got a bunch of tests here. Can you give me a channels overview? So that should have resolved to built-in channel, or should have resolved to channel basics, but it's resolving to built-in channels. And that gives you the opportunity to go back and look and see if the model needs to be retrained. Why was that phrase maybe not correctly understood? And I mentioned the insights as well. And here I can see for this particular skill, how it's working, how many people are conversing with this particular skill, what's the most popular intent or questions. And there I can see that the most word cloud, and I can also look and see anything that's been unresolved. So something got unresolved because somebody said huh, and that was unresolved. So again, that's something we might have to look at. How do we deal with it? Somebody says something we didn't quite expect. So let me go back to show you a couple of screenshots in the presentation again. So I briefly showed you those batch tests, and what we would do is, this is actually a couple of screenshots from our team page, where for what we call positive tests, so that is testing that a phrase does resolve to the correct intent. You can see that for the channels, we were getting originally a 68% pass rate. We're now up to about a 74% pass rate, which is pretty good, but lots of room for improvement. We also had a number of different tests. We also had a random test, which was basically to check that random phrases were not being handled by the skill incorrectly. So if we were to ask a question like, who's the Prime Minister of the UK, then obviously the bot should not deal with that, and it should be unresolved, or it should be handled as a that's something we don't we can't answer. And again, you can see here that we've got some testing, and we had 68% back on the 17th of September, and we're now up to, on the 19th of November, like a 98% pass rate for that test, and that's pretty important to see as well. The last test I'll show you is what we called our out of domain tests, and these were kind of interesting, is because what we would do is try and trick the NLP. So for example, with channels, we would ask it a question or have a test that had a question which was not something the bot should handle, but had some words that might be similar. So for example, there might be something like, who was the first person to fly the channel, which obviously is not something to do with digital assistant channels, but we want to make sure that is not being resolved to an intent incorrectly. And again, we keep this scorecard to see that, back on the 17th of September, we maybe had a 62% pass rate. Then we hit some problems with the score going down 46%. There was obviously some changes we made that needed to be backed out. And now we're up to about an 87% rate. So that is really how we started building Digital Assistant, and how we took it through the evolution of the design, the building blocks, training the models to try and understand, and more importantly, how we improved that model to get smarter and smarter, and testing and analytics was the key to that. So I believe we're going to do a few questions now. So what I'm going to do is give you a couple of seconds to see if there's any coming through. And I'm just going to check myself to see. Okay, here's a question coming through now. You mentioned about training the model with utterances. How many utterances should we train it with? Good question. One of the guidelines I give is quality is better than quantity, okay? But ultimately, you need a reasonable amount of data. So I would say that what we did was we typically start off with maybe 50, 60, 70 training utterances per intent, good quality ones, good quality training utterances. And we would start with that, and then gradually improve maybe 20 or 30 at a time, not massive changes, because if you made a huge amount of change, 1,000 new utterances, and retested and things went wrong, it's more difficult to work out what exactly the things you want to keep. So start off with maybe 40, 50, 60, 70 utterances, then build up. Ultimately, how many do you need? Well, the answer is, how smart do you want your bot to be? I mean, if you've trained it with 100 utterances per intent and you're getting 98% on your batch tests and scores, then that's fine. You don't need any more. So the number of utterances you need is really down to, I guess, how good you want your bot to be. I hope this answered the question. Another question here. Could RT understand different languages? This is a very, very good question. As of today, no. We built RT English only because, because we had enough on our plate, to be honest with you, building that. We have started planning for RT to support multiple languages. So one of the things we've done is that RT will take any strings that it responds with from resource bundles, and those resource bundles will be translated, so RT could respond in a different language if we wanted. One of the features we're targeting for release very soon in Oracle Digital Assistant is a native multi-language NLP, natural language processing, so that the actual language models will be able to support training the model in multiple languages such as English, German, Spanish, French, Italian, Arabic, etc. as well. Although building multi-language bots introduces its own challenges with things like culture and personality and those kind of things as well. So it's a bigger job than we wanted to take on, but we would like to do that with RT. I think I might have time for one or two more questions. Would RT work on a voice channel like Alexa? Yes. One of the nice things about the digital assistant platform is that that one digital assistant could be exposed on any number of channels. I've showed you the web, but it could be exposed on a device like a Alexa or Google Home. The only, I suppose, caveat to that is where we have designed for the web and we show links and we maybe give more verbose responses, that if you were designing for voice only, you obviously wouldn't have web links and you probably have more concise responses as well. Okay, I think it's probably time for maybe just one last question. Okay, this is a good one. Is it important that your bot deals with small talk? Great question, I love this. When I showed the demo, one of the things I did was I said to Artie, thanks, and Artie responded, great, no problem. That in itself helps create a really natural experience. If I had said thanks and Artie responded with, I'm sorry, I don't understand, that would have kind of broken the illusion. So things like small talk, thanks, that was helpful, even to more useful things like, hey, help, or I don't know what to do next. Those are all different ways of saying help. So dealing with small talk or chit chat can be really useful for things like helping people find their way around the bot, dealing with responses. And there are also situations where, for example, dealing with humor, people asking you to tell a joke, or even swearing might, in certain situations, give you an indication of how to best handle that response, whether you decide, hey, I need to hand you off to an agent, if it's a call center type of scenario as well.